The first Veldrak dropship hit Halvath City at 4:12, and Corporal Fen Dara was already at her position when the shockwave rolled down the street. She had not slept. None of them had. The evacuation order had come through at 2:30, and by the time the long columns of civilians began moving through Block 9 toward the Cauldron Gate, her 6-person fire team had taken their positions in the buildings on either side of Merchant Row. That was 70 minutes ago. Now the sky to the north glowed orange, and the deep concussion of whatever the Veldrak had just detonated was still fading in her chest. "Contact on Eris Bridge," said Private Kelson through the squad channel. His voice had the flat calm of someone who had trained for this exact scenario many hundreds of times. 2 units. Moving south, they're not in any hurry. Fen checked her corner. She could see the bridge from here, a pale arc of engineered stone over the Halvath Canal, 300 meters away. The 2 shapes moving across it were wrong in a way that was hard to look at directly. Too tall, the joints bending backward at the knee, each carrying a weapon as long as she was tall. The Veldrak did not move like anything that had evolved on a world with predators. They moved like things that had always been the predator. "Hold position," she said. "San, you have the bridge approach. Orvath, second window, watch the canal north. Hal and Mock cover the alley side. Cress, you're on the rooftops. No one fires before I call it." Behind them, the evacuation column was still moving. She could hear it, the shuffle of feet on stone, the low murmur of voices keeping themselves quiet, the occasional cry of a child quickly hushed, but she did not look back. Looking back would not help the people behind her. Keeping the street clear in front of her would. The Veldrak Armada had returned 70 years after the liberation. Every city in the hemisphere had known they were coming. The Deepwatch arrays had tracked the fleet for 9 days before it dropped into atmosphere. 9 days should have been enough to empty Halvath City. It should have been. But Halvath had 6 million residents, 4 evacuation corridors, and the northern 2 had gone dark in the first hour after planetfall. The math had never been comfortable and was now considerably worse. Fen's team was at Block 9 because Block 9 was the narrowest point on the primary evacuation route still open. The corridor funneled here, buildings on both sides pressing close, a width of 20 meters, a natural kill zone with overlapping fields of fire from 3 prepared positions. If anything tried to push south through Merchant Row while the column was still moving, this was where it would be stopped. She had been told this in the mission brief. She had studied the block survey 3 times in the last 2 weeks. She had walked every meter of Merchant Row twice and memorized the sight lines. She was 20 years old, 9 months out of the Defense Force Academy, and she had never been in a live engagement before tonight. None of that changed what the job was. The 2 Veldrak crossed the bridge and paused at the south end. She could see one of them raise something, a scanner most likely, looking for movement, looking for heat. She had been briefed on Veldrak targeting systems. They hunted by thermal signature. Their biology ran cold, and they had calibrated every weapon they made around that fact. Every building in this block had been retrofitted with thermal suppression panels 17 years ago, the work carried out by a city infrastructure crew that had logged it as routine weatherproofing on every form they filed. The squad's armor ran the same suppression system. From a scanner at 300 meters, they registered as warm as the stone around them. The 2 scouts moved again south, down the center of the street, unhurried, certain that anything worth finding would announce itself. 10 seconds, Fen said quietly. Behind her, the column kept moving. At the edge of her peripheral vision, she saw the first Veldrak's weapon arm rise, and she said, "Fire," and Block 9 became very loud very quickly. Both scouts went down in less than 4 seconds. That was the easy part. The hard part arrived 8 minutes later. A third dropship had come down 2 blocks north. She had heard the impact but not seen it land, and now Merchant Row filled with Veldrak infantry. A full strike element, 42 combat units in a loose assault formation, moving low and fast, using doorways and the wrecked hull of an overturned freight vehicle for cover. They were already returning fire before Fen's team had dropped the lead unit, which told her the scouts had transmitted before they died. The building on the east side of Merchant Row took 3 direct hits in the first 30 seconds. The wall held. That was not luck. That was the Halvath City Infrastructure Authority's contingency plan, which had been funding structural reinforcement throughout the district for 19 years under line items so mundane that no one reading the city budget would have looked twice. Fen knew the precise load rating of the wall she was standing behind because she had looked it up. Knowing it was what kept her moving when the third hit shook the floor hard enough to knock dust from the ceiling. "Hallen's hit," said Mock from the east position. "He's mobile, but one arm is out." "Keep him in position," Fen said. "Can he shoot left-handed?" "Yes." "Then he shoots left-handed." She moved to the next window and took a Veldrak coming around the canal walkway corner. A long shot, 2 rounds, the second finding the gap between chest and shoulder armor. The strike force was pinned, but it was not stopped. That was the thing about the Veldrak that the briefings had described, and she was now learning directly. They were methodical. They found the edges of a kill zone by probing it, by sending units forward until those units stopped, and then they calculated the gaps and probed again. They did not retreat for survival. They retreated only when the tactical math required it. The tactical math right now said push south. "Column status," she said. "Still moving," said San from the rooftop. "Estimate 4,000 still in the corridor, maybe 40 minutes to clear." 40 minutes. She had 6 people, 5 now, effectively, against a Veldrak strike element that had entered the fight with 42 and was down to 37. And strike elements did not operate alone. She could hear more dropships in the sky to the north, the low thunder of their entry burns, and they were not landing away from the city. The second element hit from the alley side 12 minutes after the first contact. They had gone east through the service passages that ran behind the canal-side buildings, a route that any unit with a pre-liberation map of Halvath City would know. Fen had anticipated this. The alley side positions had been prepared for it. Mock and Hallen took the first 6 before the entry point was reached, and then the alley collapsed into close-range work, and close-range work with Veldrak infantry was something she had trained for in simulation and still found brutal in reality. "Mock," she said. "Holding." His voice had changed. Something in it had been spent. "Hallen." A pause that ran 2 full seconds. "Holding." She trusted the pause more than she would have trusted a quick answer. She moved. The stairwell connecting east and west buildings ran behind the main corridor, and the access door had been modified, sealed from this side with a drop bar, a firing port cut at knee height in the lower panel, angled to cover the alley junction. She had cut that port herself, 2 days ago, with a rotary saw borrowed from the building's maintenance storage. She went flat on the stairwell floor and used it, and she worked through 8 rounds and pulled back before the second Veldrak element found the angle to answer. The element pulled off the alley approach 4 minutes after hitting it. It went back over the canal wall and regrouped. She returned to her primary position. The sky to the east was showing gray now, the very first suggestion of dawn. The orange glow to the north had spread. The Veldrak were burning something, transit infrastructure, she guessed, the Magrail junction at the north end of the district. If they had destroyed the junction, the 2 northern evacuation corridors were not just inactive, they were impassable. Everyone still inside Halvath's northern districts had one route out. This one. She had 22 rounds remaining. "Status," she said. San from the roof, reorganizing element on the bridge, bigger than the last one, 40+ units forming up. They're going to push in about 5 minutes. Mock East Alley is quiet. Hallen took a second hit, same shoulder, he's still in position. Cress, 1 Veldrak observer on the rooftop 2 buildings north. I can't get the angle from here. Fen absorbed this. 22 rounds, 1 fire team member with 2 wounds to the same arm, an observer on the high ground, and 40-plus Veldrak infantry forming for a push. She ran the numbers, and the numbers did not produce a favorable outcome. She said, "Son, the beacon." A moment of silence. Then, "Corporal, the beacon activates the full grid. The grid hasn't been tested under live fire, and once it's active—" "I know what it means," she said. "Column status, exact number if you have it." San consulted something. 2300 still in the corridor. Maybe 30 minutes at current movement rate. Maybe less if they push the pace. 30 minutes, Fen said. "Activate it." The Halvath City Integrated Defense Network had been assembled over 50 years, one funding cycle at a time, beginning the day the liberation ended and the last Veldrak ship was driven out of atmosphere. It was not a wall. It was not a garrison. It was the city itself. The thermal suppression panels in every building were one layer. Below them ran a targeting infrastructure, passive sensors embedded in road surfaces, seismic detectors in building foundations, a coherent tracking web that covered every square meter of the district and fed coordinates to batteries that had never once been activated in anything other than drill conditions. The batteries were not visible. They had been designed not to be. The parking structures on both sides of Merchant Row housed them behind composite facades that had been rated as standard construction for 19 years. The canal embankments had them built into the lower retaining courses. 6 buildings on the east side of the district had them in sealed roof housings, and the residents of those buildings paid their city maintenance fees and had never been told what else they were maintaining. The Halvath defense planners had not built a fortification. They had built a trap, the kind that required an enemy to commit fully before it closed. The beacon signal went out at 5:07, 41 minutes after first contact. For 4 seconds, nothing on the street changed. Then the upper facade of the parking structure on the north side of the canal opened. 4 panels folded back with a mechanical patience that had been stored for 50 years, and the railgun battery behind them acquired targets and fired twice. The Veldrak formation on the bridge ceased to be a formation. Then the south embankment fired, targeting the units that had broken from the bridge and were moving into the side streets. Then the roof housings on the 6 East District buildings opened and engaged the dropship that had been holding altitude 2 blocks north. Then the 3 buildings along the eastern face of Merchant Row revealed what their covered facade alcoves had been concealing for nearly 2 decades. And what they had been concealing was something that required the Veldrak observer on the rooftop to transmit a single burst signal before it was no longer capable of transmitting anything. The sound was enormous, and then it was not, because the things making noise were no longer maneuvering. The street went quiet. In the quiet from somewhere to the south, she could still hear the evacuation column moving. Feet on stone, the murmur of voices, a child somewhere in the middle of it asking a question she could not make out. She stayed at her position and watched the street. At 5:41, San's voice, "Column clear, gate is closed." She set her weapon against the wall and looked at her hands for a moment. They were shaking, which she noted without judgment. She had 22 rounds left and had not had to fire them. "Everyone up," she said, "Hallen first." They assembled slowly, which was appropriate. Hallen had made himself a sling from a strip of wire insulation and was moving under his own power. Mock had a sealed gash along his jaw that he reported as minor. Cress had no wounds and said she thought that was mostly luck. San came down from the roof last, reading his scanner. "The Armada is holding in low orbit," he said. "They're not attempting a second descent." She understood why. The Halvath network had neutralized a full strike element and 2 dropships in under 8 minutes. Every city in the hemisphere had an equivalent network. The Veldrak Armada had returned with intelligence 70 years out of date, expecting to find the district maps they had burned when they occupied this city, expecting buildings that would fall to 3 hits and streets that would give way to 40 infantry. They had found a city that remembered what they had done. A city that had spent 50 years quietly, patiently, without announcements or monuments, turning every block into an answer. "Report to the gate," Fen said. "Medical for Hallen, debriefs when command calls them." She walked south down the empty corridor of Block 9. The thermal panels were still active. The facade alcoves had closed. The street looked like what it had always looked like from the outside, an ordinary commercial block, the kind of place where nothing in particular happened. She did not look up at the sky. The sky was being watched by systems better suited to watching it, from orbital platforms and long-range arrays that had been tracking the Armada since before it entered atmosphere. The Armada would hold where it was, or it would be given a reason to leave, and either outcome had been prepared for by people who had been preparing for a very long time. The line had held. That was what the job had asked for. She walked through the gate.